My husband humiliated me at our family anniversary dinner, mocking my hard-earned success in front of 50 elite guests. He raised his crystal glass and told the entire room that my recent promotion to managing partner was nothing more than a corporate diversity quota. His relatives, the so-called pillars of the community, laughed out loud. His brother-in-law Caleb, a man who built his entire career on inherited wealth and white privilege, clapped the loudest, calling me a corporate charity case who did not deserve to sit at their prestigious table. I did not scream. I did not throw my drink. I said absolutely nothing. Instead, I calmly picked up my phone, made one single call, and walked straight out the front door. Minutes later, the cruel laughter inside that grand dining room stopped completely. The moment they realized who was on the other end of that line and what I had just authorized, every arrogant face in that room went completely pale. My name is Nia. I am 34 years old and I am a senior mergers and acquisitions director on Wall Street. If you have ever been treated like a second-class citizen by the people who are supposed to be your family, hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. You will want to stay until the end to hear exactly how I financially dismantled my in-laws' fake empire and left them with absolutely nothing. For 7 years, I was the quiet, supportive wife to Marcus, the supposed financial genius and beloved son of Pastor Thomas and First Lady Vivian. They are the royalty of the Atlanta megachurch scene, living in a sprawling multi-million-dollar estate built on tithes and fake righteousness. From the day Marcus and I got married, his family made it abundantly clear that I did not belong. I grew up in a working-class neighborhood fighting for every single academic scholarship I could get. I climbed the corporate ladder by working 80-hour weeks, analyzing market trends, and executing ruthless corporate takeovers. But to my mother-in-law, Vivian, I was just a girl from the wrong side of the tracks who was lucky her son had lowered his standards. She constantly compared me to my sister-in-law Jasmine, a former sorority queen, who spent her days shopping on her husband Caleb's credit cards and contributing absolutely nothing to society. They loved to remind me of my place. They treated me like a stray dog they had generously allowed into their pristine gated community. They thought because I stayed quiet and kept my head down at family gatherings I was weak. They assumed my silence meant I was intimidated by their designer clothes, their country club memberships, and their towering social status. But in my line of work, you learn to observe before you strike. You learn to let your opponents get comfortable, let them get arrogant, and let them reveal their deepest vulnerabilities. In the boardroom, I was known for tearing apart billion-dollar companies without breaking a sweat. At home, I played the dutiful wife because I believed in my marriage. They mistook my patience for submission. They had no idea they were poking a sleeping bear, and they certainly did not know I already held the keys to their absolute financial destruction. The illusion of perfection was the only currency my in-laws truly valued. In their world, Sunday mornings were never about faith. They were high-stakes fashion shows and elite networking events, disguised as religious gatherings. Pastor Thomas and First Lady Vivian ruled over a congregation of 10,000 people, commanding absolute obedience, demanding lavish tithes, and constantly posing for local lifestyle magazines. Their entire existence relied on projecting an immaculate, untouchable facade. To them, bloodlines, zip codes, and social affiliations meant everything. I was a glaring stain on their carefully curated family portrait. Growing up, my mother worked two exhausting jobs just to keep the heating on in our tiny, drafty apartment. I learned the true value of a dollar by watching her count pennies at the grocery checkout. I earned my way into top-tier universities through sheer grit, fighting tooth and nail for every academic scholarship available. But to Vivian, my degrees and my work ethic meant absolutely nothing because I lacked a prestigious family name. She made sure I knew it every single time we shared the same breathing space. She would introduce me to wealthy church elders with a patronizing smile, describing me as Marcus's little charity project, a hard-working girl from the struggle that he was generously helping to polish for polite society. Then there was Jasmine. My sister-in-law was the ultimate golden child, a woman who peaked during her college sorority days and never bothered to develop a personality beyond her shopping habits. She had married Caleb, a white investment broker, who coasted through life on generational wealth and a profound sense of unearned superiority. Jasmine treated her marriage to a wealthy white man with a trust fund as if it were a royal coronation. She paraded around our family dinners in designer dresses paid for by Caleb's family money, looking down her nose at everyone, but saving her sharpest venom for me. She loved to drop subtle insults carefully disguised as helpful sisterly advice. She would publicly ask if I needed to borrow one of her old luxury handbags for a corporate dinner, implying my own professional wardrobe was far too cheap for my industry. She would loudly wonder why I worked such grueling hours, batting her eyelashes, and asking if Marcus was failing to provide for me properly. Her favorite party trick was cornering me near the appetizers to ask if I ever felt completely out of place, surrounded by people who actually belonged in the upper class. She thrived on trying to make me feel small. Marcus never once defended me. Whenever Jasmine threw her passive-aggressive jabs, he would just chuckle, sip his drink, and tell me to lighten up. I was too busy desperately trying to impress Caleb, practically begging for his brother-in-law's validation. Marcus wanted so badly to be seen as an equal to Caleb. He craved the status, the easy money, and the effortless privilege that Caleb threw around like spare change. I watched this toxic, pathetic dynamic play out year after year, biting my tongue while I quietly built my own corporate empire in the shadows. I knew their lavish lifestyle was nothing more than a fragile house of cards. They were completely obsessed with looking rich, but I was the only one in that family who actually understood how real wealth was created, controlled, and ultimately destroyed. And the first card was about to fall. The first warning sign did not come from a whispered rumor or a misplaced text message. It arrived in the form of a sterile automated banking alert on a random Tuesday evening. I was sitting in my home office reviewing quarterly earnings reports for a potential acquisition when I logged into our joint high-yield savings account. The number staring back at me was wrong. Exactly $150,000 had vanished. No warning, no discussion. Just a massive wire transfer initiated at 2 in the afternoon, routed to an obscure holding company I had never seen before. I did not panic. I am a mergers and acquisitions director. When numbers do not align, I do not get emotional. I traced the data. I pulled the wire authorization and saw Marcus's digital signature. He had drained over half of our liquid emergency fund with a single click. I walked into the master bedroom. Marcus was lounging on our custom-upholstered bed, scrolling mindlessly through his phone, looking completely unbothered. I stood at the foot of the bed holding my tablet. I kept my voice flat, devoid of any inflection. Marcus, where did $150,000 go? I did not even have the decency to look surprised. He let out an exaggerated sigh, tossed his phone onto the nightstand, and rubbed his face like I was a nagging child interrupting his highly important evening. Relax, Nia, he said, using that condescending tone he always reserved for moments when he knew he was dead wrong. It is not gone. It is reallocated. Caleb let me in on a ground floor investment opportunity, a private startup project. It is strictly invite only, and we had to move fast. I stared at him, letting the sheer absurdity of his words hang in the heavy air between us. You would withdrew 6 figures of our joint money. Money I primarily earned to hand over to your sister's husband for a secret project. And you did not think to consult me, the woman who literally evaluates corporate investments for a living. Marcus sat up, his defensiveness instantly spiking into hostility. This is exactly why I did not tell you. I knew you would kill the deal with your endless questions and your obsession with risk. Caleb warned me you would react exactly like this. My blood went ice cold. Caleb warned you. Yes, Marcus snapped, standing up to pace the room. He said you have a working-class mindset. You are so terrified of going back to the hood that you just want to hoard cash under a mattress. You do not understand how real wealth is generated, Nia. This is how the elite operate. They move fast, they leverage capital, and they build empires. You are just a corporate drone working for a paycheck. Caleb is giving me a seat at the big table. I watched him pace. The sweat was already forming on his upper lip. His voice was too loud, his gestures too erratic. He was regurgitating Caleb's elitist garbage word for word. He was so desperate for his white brother-in-law's approval that he was willing to bankrupt his own family just to feel included in the boys' club. "You are not at the big table, Marcus," I said coldly. "You are the mark. If this was a legitimate startup, there would be a prospectus. There would be a term sheet, cap tables, and a clear return on investment projection. You are a vice president at a financial firm. You know the protocols. Where are the documents? What is the registered name of the LLC? Who is the managing director?" Marcus waved his hand dismissively, actively avoiding my gaze. "It does not work like that at this level. It is a handshake deal between brothers. You would not understand the trust involved because you view everything as a cold transaction. This is about vision, Nia, something you severely lack. You can analyze spreadsheets all day, but you have no entrepreneurial foresight. I am building a legacy for us, and instead of supporting your black husband, you are emasculating me over a temporary cash transfer." I was weaponizing our race, twisting the narrative to make himself the victim. He expected me to shrink, to apologize for questioning his authority, to bow my head and play the supportive, blindly loyal wife that his mother Vivian had trained all the women in her church to be. He wanted me to doubt my own financial literacy to soothe his fragile ego. A temporary cash transfer. I stepped closer to him, refusing to break eye contact. "You transferred our money to a shell LLC with no verifiable assets. You did not invest, Marcus. You got fleeced. You are just jealous," he yelled, pointing a finger directly at my face. "You are threatened because I am finally stepping out of your shadow. You love having the bigger salary because it makes you feel superior. Well, when this startup explodes and I am bringing in millions, you will see. Caleb knows what he is doing. He was born into this world. I trust him." There it was. The pathetic, naked truth laid bare in our bedroom. He trusted Caleb's unearned white privilege more than he trusted his own wife's proven hard-earned expertise. Marcus was so blinded by his inferiority complex that he had willingly handed over our financial security for a scrap of validation. He thought he was buying respect from a man who secretly despised him. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream or throw the tablet at his head, even though every instinct in my body demanded violence. Screaming gives away your power. It shows the enemy that they have successfully wounded you. Instead, I gave him a slow, chilling smile. "All right, Marcus," I said softly. "Build your legacy." I turned on my heel and walked out of the bedroom, leaving him standing there breathless and confused by my sudden surrender. He thought he had won the argument. He thought his aggressive posturing had successfully put me in my place. But as I walked back down the hall to my office, my mind was already shifting gears, transforming from a betrayed wife into the apex predator Wall Street paid me to be. Marcus had not just made a terrible financial decision, he had declared war on my livelihood, and I was going to tear his little startup project apart piece by piece until there was nothing left but ashes. The opportunity to confront the architect of my husband's foolishness presented itself a mere 3 days later at the mandatory Sunday brunch. In my in-laws' world, Sunday afternoons were not for rest. They were a weekly performance hosted at Pastor Thomas and First Lady Vivian's sprawling estate. The house was an architectural monstrosity, built on the backs of thousands of working-class parishioners, yet decorated to look like an old money plantation. I arrived precisely on time, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than Marcus's entire wardrobe, carrying myself with the quiet grace of a woman who held no debts and feared no one. Marcus had been avoiding me since our argument, choosing to ride to the estate early with his mother under the guise of helping with church business. The moment I stepped onto the marble patio overlooking the pristine swimming pool, I spotted him. Caleb. He was lounging on a custom wicker sofa, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon at 1 in the afternoon. He wore his signature uniform, a designer fleece vest layered over a crisp, aggressively casual button-down shirt. It was the exact aesthetic of a man who desperately wanted to look like a venture capitalist, but had never actually built a single thing with his own 2 hands. Jasmine sat beside him, loudly complaining to a caterer about the temperature of the shrimp hors d'oeuvres, her wrists dripping in gold bracelets. Caleb caught my eye. A slow, greasy smile spread across his face. He set his glass down and gestured for me to come over, waving his hand with the lazy entitlement of an overseer beckoning a subordinate. Nia, he called out, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure the surrounding family members could hear. Come sit with us. Marcus tells me you have been losing sleep over our little joint venture. I walked over, my heels clicking sharply against the stone patio, and stood exactly 2 feet away from him. I did not sit. By remaining standing, I forced him to look up at me, stripping away a fraction of his physical dominance. I am not losing sleep, Caleb. I am simply awaiting the basic financial disclosures that typically accompany a six-figure capital transfer. I kept my voice perfectly modulated, pleasant, but completely devoid of warmth. Where is the term sheet? Caleb let out a booming, patronizing laugh. He looked past me toward Marcus, who had just stepped onto the patio and immediately frozen like a deer caught in headlights. Caleb shook his head, offering me a look of deep theatrical pity. You know, Nia, I have always admired your hustle, Caleb said, leaning back and crossing his legs. I really have. You are incredibly articulate for someone from your background. You have that raw, urban grit. You work like a machine, grinding away for a paycheck. But that is exactly your problem. You are trapped in a poverty mindset. You are so terrified of going broke again that you cannot see the forest for the trees. He took a slow sip of his bourbon, letting his insult marinate in the humid Georgia air. He knew exactly what he was doing. Calling a black woman articulate is not a compliment. It is a microaggression designed to express surprise that I possess basic intelligence. Calling my professional expertise a poverty mindset was his way of reminding me that he was born into generational wealth, while I had to claw my way out of a struggling neighborhood. I did not flinch. I let him talk. Let the enemy lay out their entire strategy before you make your first move. Institutional finance is dead. Nia, he continued, using his hands to paint an imaginary picture in the air. The real wealth is happening in decentralized capital, private equity circles where access is strictly based on who you know. I got Marcus past the velvet rope. I threw him a lifeline, because I know how hard it is for him to live with a woman who constantly needs to wear the pants. He needed a win. He needed to feel like the provider. You should be thanking me for saving your marriage instead of demanding paperwork like a low-level auditor. Jasmine chimed in, swirling her mimosa and glaring at me over her designer sunglasses. Honestly, Nia, you are so domineering. You are embarrassing Marcus. Caleb is literally handing you two a fortune, and you are acting like a paranoid bank teller. This is why it is so hard for successful black men to thrive. Their women never support their vision. I looked at Jasmine. She was weaponizing the trauma of our own community to defend a white man who was actively stealing from her brother. It was a masterpiece of brainwashing. I shifted my gaze back to Caleb, bypassing her entirely. She was just a parrot. He was the ventriloquist. If it is a private equity circle, Caleb, then there is a lead underwriter, I said calmly, stepping half an inch closer. There is a post-money valuation. There is an SEC filing exemption code, likely a Regulation D Rule 506. Which specific exemption are you operating under? And what is the liquidity horizon? Caleb's smile stiffened. The corner of his left eye twitched. It was a micro-expression lasting less than a second, but in my line of work a twitch is as loud as a gunshot. He did not know the answers. He was throwing around buzzwords like decentralized capital to mask the fact that he had absolutely no idea how high-level institutional finance actually functioned. He was a fraud playing dress-up in a rich man's clothes. You are getting stuck in the weeds again, Nia, Caleb scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. This is exactly what I mean. You are too rigid. You analyze everything to death because you lack entrepreneurial instinct. The money is deployed. It is yielding results. Just sit back, let your husband handle the heavy lifting for once and enjoy the returns when they hit. Marcus stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder, trying to physically steer me away from the conversation. That is enough, Nia, Marcus hissed under his breath. Stop humiliating me in front of my family. Caleb has it handled. I looked down at Marcus's hand on my shoulder, then looked up into his eyes with a gaze so glacial he immediately pulled his arm back as if he had been burned. I turned my attention back to Caleb. I noticed Caleb's watch. It was a Patek Philippe. To the untrained eye, it was a symbol of massive wealth. But I deal with billionaires daily. The weight of the casing was wrong. The sweep of the second hand was slightly too rigid. It was a high-quality counterfeit. Caleb was drowning in debt. The unearned arrogance, the cheap psychological manipulation, the refusal to produce a single shred of documentation. It all painted a brilliant, blindingly clear picture. There was no startup, there was no decentralized investment fund. I offered Caleb a bright, chilling smile. You are absolutely right, Caleb. I suppose my working-class background makes me a bit too meticulous with details. I will leave the heavy lifting to you and Marcus. I look forward to seeing the returns. I turned and walked into the grand estate, leaving them to their mimosas and their hollow laughter. Caleb thought he had successfully gaslit me. He thought he had used my race, my gender, and my upbringing to shame me into silence. He thought he was the smartest man in the room because society had always handed him the microphone and told him his voice mattered most. But as I walked through the lavish halls of my in-laws' house, my mind was running complex financial algorithms. Caleb was not an investing genius. He was a desperate cornered animal, and desperate men leave sloppy digital footprints. I knew exactly where I needed to look. I was going to find out exactly whose pockets that $150,000 had lined, and when I found the money, I was going to use it to choke the life out of his fake, arrogant empire. I made my way through the labyrinth of the estate, seeking the quiet sanctuary of the library. The heavy mahogany doors were already open. Sitting behind the massive executive desk, flanked by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with unread religious texts, was my mother-in-law. First Lady Vivian wore a tailored pearl-white suit and a diamond cross that caught the afternoon light. Her face was set into a mask of pious authority, the kind she used to shame single mothers from the pulpit every Sunday. On the desk in front of her rested a thick stack of legal documents, meticulously marked with bright yellow signature tags. "Close the door, Nia," she commanded, not bothering to look up as she smoothed the edges of the paper. "We need to have a conversation about your role in this family." I closed the door but remained standing. I had no intention of getting comfortable in a room designed for interrogations. Vivian tapped a manicured fingernail against the top document. "Marcus tells me you are causing unnecessary friction regarding his new business venture with Caleb. He is deeply hurt by your lack of faith. In a marriage, a lack of faith is a lack of love. A woman of God stands behind her husband, supports his vision, and acts as his peace, not his adversary." I kept my face perfectly neutral. "You are not a marriage counselor, Vivian. And this is not a marital spat. This is about $150,000 of missing capital." "It is not missing," she snapped, her veneer of holy patience cracking instantly. "It is seeded. But Marcus and Caleb have hit a crucial growth phase. They need immediate liquidity to secure a commercial real estate asset for the fund. Caleb's trust is temporarily tied up in probate, and Marcus cannot leverage his current assets without alerting the church board, which we simply will not do. Therefore, as his wife, it falls on you to provide the bridge capital." She turned the document around and slid a gold pen across the polished wood. It was a home equity line of credit agreement. The collateral listed was my townhouse, the property I had purchased entirely on my own 3 years before I even met Marcus. It was my sanctuary paid off with the bonuses I earned bleeding over spreadsheets while my peers were out partying. "You want me to mortgage my premarital property to fund Caleb's imaginary venture," I said, stating the facts flatly to force her to hear how absurd they sounded. Vivian stood up, leaning over the desk. "I want you to be a wife. I want you to submit to the spiritual and financial head of your household. We brought you into this family, Nia. We elevated your social standing. We allowed you to sit at tables you could never have dreamed of reaching on your own. It is time you paid your dues. Sign the papers. The loan will be paid back within 6 months, and Marcus will finally have the respect he deserves." The library doors opened behind me. I did not need to turn around to know who had entered. The heavy scent of Caleb's expensive cologne preceded him, followed by the shuffling footsteps of Marcus and the sharp click of Jasmine's heels. It was a coordinated ambush. They had planned this. They had drawn me into the house to corner me away from the other guests, hoping the combined weight of their intimidation would force my hand. "Listen to my mother, Nia," Jasmine said, her voice dripping with venom. "You have always been so utterly selfish. Marcus works tirelessly to build a name for yourselves, and you hoard your little assets like a dragon. It is embarrassing. A real black woman uplifts her man. You are just suffocating him." Marcus stepped beside his mother, refusing to make eye contact with me. Just sign the document, Nia. It is just a temporary hold on the deed. Caleb has the buyers lined up. We just need the cash to close the escrow. Do not make this harder than it has to be. Caleb leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, wearing that same infuriating lazy smirk. It is just standard leverage, Nia. You put up the collateral, we do the heavy lifting, everyone wins. Unless, of course, you really do not believe in your husband. That would be a tragedy. I looked at the four of them. This was the illustrious family I had married into. A pastor's wife demanding I surrender my hard-earned property. A golden child sister weaponizing our race and gender to protect her white husband's ego. A cowardly husband who lacked the spine to ask me himself, hiding behind his mother's skirt. And a white con artist pulling all their strings, manipulating their deep-seated insecurities for his own financial gain. My mind clicked into hyper-analytical mode. The contempt I felt for them was absolute, pure, and crystal clear. I analyzed the data right in front of me. Caleb was broke. His trust fund being in probate was a textbook lie used by trust fund kids who had already blown through their inheritance. Vivian and Thomas were financially overextended. If they had the cash, Vivian would have secretly given it to Marcus to maintain the family image. But they could not touch the church funds right now without triggering an audit, hence her comment about the board. And Marcus was so desperate to prove his worth that he was willing to make his wife homeless to fund a scam. They were bleeding out. They were all drowning in debt, suffocating under the weight of their own manufactured prestige. They did not see me as family. They saw me as an unmapped bank account. They saw me as the mule they could ride to financial safety. I looked down at the gold pen. I picked it up, rolling the cool metal between my fingers. Marcus exhaled a heavy sigh of relief. Jasmine crossed her arms and let out a triumphant little scoff. Vivian smiled, her holy mask snapping back into place. I calmly dropped the pen onto the hardwood floor. It landed with a sharp clatter that echoed in the silent library. I am not signing anything, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the room like a blade. And if any of you ever attempt to leverage my assets to cover your incompetence again, I will have you investigated for attempted financial fraud. The room erupted. You ungrateful wretch, Vivian shrieked, slamming her hands on the desk. You will always be trash. You can buy all the designer suits you want, but you will always have the stench of the projects on you. My son lowered himself to marry you. You are barren, you are cold, and you are entirely useless to this family. Jasmine stepped forward, her face twisted in rage. You are just mad because you will never be a real woman. You want to be the man so badly that you are castrating your own husband. You are a miserable, lonely corporate drone, and nobody actually likes you. Marcus finally found his voice, yelling over his sister. I am the head of this house. You will do what I say, Nia. I am ordering you to sign that paper. You owe me for putting up with your miserable attitude for 7 years. Caleb did not yell. He just watched me, his eyes narrowing, finally realizing that his psychological parlor tricks were not going to work. He recognized the look in my eyes. It was the look of someone who was completely unaffected by their noise. I let them scream. I let them hurl their toxic, hateful insults. Every word they screamed only confirmed my hypothesis. They were terrified. The louder they yelled, the weaker they looked. They were a pack of parasites, realizing the host had just cut off the blood supply. I turned my back on Vivian and walked slowly toward the door. Marcus moved to block my path, puffing out his chest to physically intimidate me. I did not break my stride. I stepped squarely into his personal space, tilting my head up to look him dead in the eyes. Move, Marcus, I commanded, my voice deadly and absolute, or I promise you I will take everything you have left. He swallowed hard. The fake bravado crumbled instantly. He stepped aside, his eyes dropping to the floor. I walked out of the library, leaving the doors wide open. Their screams followed me down the long, opulent hallway, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings and expensive portraits. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought they could break my spirit by attacking my roots, my womanhood, and my marriage. They did not realize that they had just given me the final piece of motivation I needed to destroy them completely. I walked out the front doors of the estate and handed the valet my ticket. As I waited for my car in the stifling Georgia heat, I pulled out my phone. I had no intention of going home to cry. I had work to do. Caleb needed $150,000 desperately enough to orchestrate this entire humiliating ambush. That meant the money was not sitting in a decentralized fund. It was paying off a highly urgent, highly sensitive debt. I was going to follow that wire transfer. I was going to find out exactly where my money went, and I was going to use that information to execute the most flawless, ruthless corporate slaughter this fake, pathetic family had ever seen. The drive back to my townhouse was a masterclass in compartmentalization. I turned off the radio and let the silence fill the cabin of my car. In the world of high-stakes mergers and acquisitions, emotional volatility is a liability. You do not win negotiations by throwing tantrums, and you certainly do not destroy your enemies by screaming at them in a library. You destroy them by dismantling their infrastructure. By the time I pulled into my private garage, the burning rage in my chest had cooled into something far more dangerous. It had crystallized into absolute clinical focus. I walked straight to my home office, locked the door, and powered on my customized triple-monitor workstation. This was my sanctuary. This was the command center where I had orchestrated corporate takeovers worth billions of dollars. Caleb and Marcus thought they were playing a high-level game of financial chess. They had no idea they had just invited a grandmaster to the board. When I evaluate a target company for a hostile takeover, the first phase is forensic due diligence. You ignore the glossy marketing brochures, the charismatic pitch decks, and the CEO's confident speeches. You look at the raw data because numbers are incapable of lying. Marcus had made a fatal amateur mistake when he wired that $150,000. He had initiated the transfer from our joint high-yield savings account. As a primary account holder, I did not need a subpoena or a private investigator to pull the transaction metadata. I had legal unfettered access to the routing numbers. I logged into our banking portal and exported the wire transfer receipt. I isolated the receiving ABA routing number and the beneficiary account details. The money had been sent to an entity registered as Vanguard Horizon Holdings LLC. The name itself was a pathetic generic amalgamation of corporate buzzwords, exactly the kind of shell company an arrogant amateur would register to sound legitimate. I cross-referenced the receiving bank. It was not a Tier 1 financial institution. It was a regional secondary bank known for expedited commercial accounts and relaxed compliance standards. A genuine decentralized equity fund backed by generational wealth would be operating through Morgan Stanley Goldman Sachs, or at the very least, a boutique private wealth management firm. Caleb was routing 6 figures of my hard-earned capital through a strip mall bank. I opened my Bloomberg terminal, a tool that Caleb probably only knew from watching movies about Wall Street. I ran a comprehensive search on Vanguard Horizon Holdings LLC. In the realm of institutional finance, establishing a private equity syndicate requires a massive regulatory footprint. You must file a Form D with the Securities and Exchange Commission to claim a Regulation D exemption. You must provide a private placement memorandum outlining the capitalization table, the managing partners, and the specific risk factors of the investment. You must have a verified roster of accredited investors. I queried the SEC EDGAR database. The result was a glaring, beautiful blank screen. No Form D, no regulatory filings, no registered prospectus. Caleb had not filed a single piece of federal documentation. To legally raise private capital without these filings is a direct violation of federal securities law. Caleb was not running a sophisticated exclusive investment circle. He was operating an unregistered, highly illegal financial ghost ship. I pushed deeper, accessing the Delaware Division of Corporations Registry. Shell companies are designed to hide the identities of their beneficial owners, usually by employing a registered agent service to act as a buffer. But Caleb was lazy. He had hired the cheapest, most heavily advertised registered agent service in Wilmington, Delaware. Using public property records and corporate cross-referencing, I traced the franchise tax payments back to their origin. The payment trail bypassed any corporate treasury and led directly to a personal credit card. Caleb's personal credit card, I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and allowed myself a cold, genuine smile. Caleb was not managing a portfolio. He was the sole proprietor of a hollow shell. I remembered the brief glimpse of the digital prospectus Marcus had tried to wave in my face a few days prior. Now that I knew the entity was entirely fictitious, I could mentally reverse engineer the fake document. The EBITDA projections Marcus had been so proud of were mathematically impossible. The cash flow statements did not reconcile with the supposed operational costs. It was a glorified PDF decorated with stock photography and imaginary return on investment metrics. It was designed specifically to dazzle a financially illiterate Mark, who was desperate to feel like a titan of industry. Marcus was the perfect gullible target, but a glaring question remained. If Vanguard Horizon Holdings LLC had no actual operational assets, no development projects, and no commercial real estate holdings, as Vivian had so fiercely claimed, what was the purpose of the entity? A shell company does not just hold cash for the sake of it. It is a conduit. It is a vehicle designed to launder money, obscure the origin of funds, or funnel capital toward a highly specific, highly toxic liability. Caleb called me a woman with a poverty mindset. He mocked me for demanding paperwork. He stood on the patio of his mother-in-law's mansion swirling premium bourbon, acting as though he held the keys to the financial universe. But the data on my screens told a story of absolute desperation. You do not coerce your brother-in-law into draining his emergency savings to fund a legitimate venture. You do it because you have a catastrophic cash deficit and you are out of options. You do it because the banks have cut you off, your family trust is either non-existent or depleted, and you need liquid capital immediately to stop something terrible from happening. The $150,000 was not seed money. It was a life raft. Caleb was drowning, and he had dragged my husband underwater to use him as a flotation device. I pulled up the corporate ledger data I had managed to scrape from a secondary credit reporting agency. I needed to see the outflow. Money had gone into the Vanguard Horizon Holdings account on Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon. By Thursday morning, the account balance had shifted. The funds had not sat idle. A massive outgoing wire transfer had been initiated. I traced the destination of the outgoing funds. In the world of M&A, when you trace a fraudulent payout, you expect to find offshore accounts, Cayman Island tax havens, or convoluted cryptocurrency wallets. You expect a sophisticated laundering protocol. But Caleb was not sophisticated. He was an arrogant, privileged man who believed he was untouchable simply because of his zip code and his skin color. He did not bother to launder the money through a secondary tumbler. He wired it directly to a domestic real estate escrow account. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I accessed county property tax records and digital deed registries. If the money went into a real estate escrow, there had to be a corresponding property acquisition. I filtered the public records for the exact dollar amount and the specific escrow agency used by Caleb's shell company. The search algorithm processed the query. The results populated on my center monitor. It was not a commercial real estate asset for a high-yield fund. It was not a development lot or an office building. The property purchased with my stolen savings was a luxury high-rise condominium located in one of the most exclusive, hyper-expensive districts in Midtown Atlanta. I pulled the deed of trust. The property was not registered under Caleb's name. It was not registered under Marcus's name. It was not even registered under the shell company. The condominium had been purchased outright in cash, and the title was legally vested under the name of a single private individual. I stared at the name on the screen. The financial puzzle pieces violently snapped into place, revealing a picture so grotesque, so deeply treacherous, that for a moment, the sheer audacity of it took my breath away. The money was not an investment. It was hush money. It was a payoff to bury a secret that could destroy their entire family. I memorized the name on the deed, and I prepared to burn their world to the ground. The name on the screen was Chloe Summers. To anyone else, it would be just a sequence of letters, an anonymous recipient of a luxury real estate transaction. But in the tightly knit, highly toxic ecosystem of my in-laws' social circle, that name was a live grenade. Chloe Summers was Caleb's former executive assistant. She was a 20-something graduate who had spent the last 2 years fetching his coffee, organizing his schedule and absorbing the arrogant elitism that radiated from his office. 6 months ago, she had abruptly resigned. Jasmine had gossiped about it at a family dinner, making cruel remarks about how the girl simply could not handle the pressure of institutional finance. Caleb had smiled tightly and quickly changed the subject. Now I knew why. I opened a secure browser window and initiated a deep dive into Chloe's digital footprint. I scraped her public social media profiles, cross-referencing timestamps, geolocation tags, and background imagery. People engaged in illicit affairs always think they are untraceable, but vanity is a fatal disease. Chloe loved to post aesthetic photos of her supposedly glamorous life. I zoomed in on a photo posted 3 months ago taken at an upscale steakhouse in Buckhead. She was holding a martini glass. Reflected in the polished base of the glass was the distinct custom-tailored sleeve of a suit jacket, a dark navy windowpane check with a maroon silk lining. I knew that jacket intimately because I had bought it for Marcus last Christmas to celebrate a promotion he barely deserved. The timeline aligned with terrifying precision. Marcus had started taking late-night client meetings right around the time Chloe abruptly resigned from Caleb's firm. The mysterious weekend conferences, the sudden obsession with privacy on his phone, the overcompensation of aggressive domineering posturing at home. He was sleeping with his brother-in-law's assistant. But an affair alone did not explain the financial mechanics. Why would Marcus route the money through a shell company owned by Caleb? If Marcus wanted to buy his mistress a luxury condominium, he could have done it secretly, albeit clumsily, on his own. Involving Caleb meant Caleb held the reins. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, as the sickening reality of their arrangement materialized in my mind. Caleb had caught them. He had discovered Marcus sleeping with Chloe. For a manipulative predator like Caleb, discovering the golden son of Atlanta's most prominent megachurch in a career-destroying, family-shattering scandal was not a tragedy. It was absolute leverage. It was the ultimate weapon. Caleb was drowning in his own financial failures and needed a compliant, wealthy pawn to act as a buffer for his own toxic liabilities. By discovering the affair, Caleb effectively owned Marcus. He had blackmailed my husband. Caleb engineered the Vanguard Horizon Holdings shell company, not just as a fake investment fund, but as an untraceable laundering vehicle. He convinced Marcus that setting up the shell company was the only way to safely buy the condo and keep Chloe quiet, without triggering a direct audit from our joint accounts that I might spot. But Caleb was not doing it out of brotherly solidarity. He was securing a leash. By facilitating the transfer, Caleb ensured that Marcus was legally and financially bound to him. If Marcus ever stepped out of line, if Marcus ever refused a demand, Caleb could instantly expose the shell company, the affair, and the missing funds to Vivian, Pastor Thomas, and the entire 10,000-member congregation. That explained Marcus's pathetic, desperate obedience on the patio. It explained why Marcus had looked at Caleb with the terrified eyes of a hostage while trying to play the dominant husband in front of me. Marcus was not investing in a decentralized equity fund. He was paying an extortion fee, using my hard-earned capital, to finance a luxury cage for his mistress, all orchestrated by a white con artist who was treating the beloved black son of a megachurch like a puppet on a string. The absolute staggering cowardice of it all made my stomach turn. Marcus had sat in the library, flanked by his mother and sister, demanding I mortgage my premarital home to fund his so-called vision. He had weaponized his role as the spiritual head of the household. He had allowed his mother to call me barren and useless. He had allowed his sister to question my womanhood. And he had done it all to protect a dirty, pathetic secret, because he lacked the spine to face the consequences of his own infidelity. They had demanded my property to cover their tracks. They wanted to strip me of everything I had built so they could maintain their flawless, holy facade. Vivian preaching about a woman's submission while her son embezzled marital assets to fund a mistress. Jasmine defending her husband's financial genius while he ran a blackmail ring against her own brother. The hypocrisy was so dense, so utterly putrid that it almost suffocated me. I did not cry. Crying is a biological response to pain, and I felt absolutely no pain. You cannot mourn a marriage that never actually existed. You cannot grieve the loss of a man who is nothing more than a hollow, spineless parasite. The only emotion running through my veins was a pure, highly concentrated dose of adrenaline. I felt a supreme, terrifying clarity taking over my mind. I began systematically archiving every piece of evidence. I downloaded the deed of trust. I screen captured the geolocation data from Chloe's social media alongside the reflection of Marcus's suit. I pulled the IP addresses from the Vanguard Horizon Holdings registration to prove Caleb's direct, irrefutable involvement. I compiled the data into a secure encrypted dossier. In my world, a dossier like this is known as a kill shot. It is the document you slide across a boardroom table right before you ask for the opposing CEO's immediate, unconditional resignation. But I was not going to ask for a resignation. I was going to demand total surrender. I looked at the framed photos on my office wall, pictures of Marcus and me smiling at various galas and church functions. He had stood beside me wearing suits I paid for driving cars. I financed living in a lifestyle my grueling hours had subsidized, all while funneling my cash to a 20-something assistant. He thought I was just a rigid working-class girl who would eventually fold under the pressure of his family's elite status. Caleb thought I was just an angry black woman he could gaslight into submission. Vivian thought I was a disposable asset she could bully into signing away my safety net. They had underestimated me to a fatal degree. They viewed my meticulous nature as a weakness, an inability to understand the fast-paced world of high finance. They did not realize that my meticulous nature was exactly what made me the most dangerous person they would ever cross paths with. I shut down the background check windows and opened my corporate email client. While Marcus was busy playing house with his mistress and bowing to his brother-in-law's blackmail, I had been working on a highly confidential project that was about to reach its absolute climax. The personal betrayal I had just uncovered was deeply satisfying in its own twisted way, but it was only the first half of my revenge. The second half required me to step out of the shadows of my marriage and fully embrace the power I wielded on Wall Street. I was not just going to destroy their family dynamic. I was going to obliterate the very company they used to fund their miserable, arrogant lives. My inbox loaded. The top message was flagged with high importance from the board of directors at Vanguard Capital. I opened it. It was the finalized executive resolution. Effective immediately, I was officially appointed as the managing partner of Vanguard Capital. I stared at the digital signature of the chairman. This was not a diversity quota. This was a coronation. I had generated billions in revenue for the firm over the past 5 years. I had gutted failing corporations, restructured their assets, and delivered unprecedented returns. While Vivian was busy organizing bake sales and judging women's hemlines at Greater Hope Ministry, I had just secured a seat at one of the most powerful financial tables in the global market. I was now operating with a 9-figure discretionary acquisition budget. Wall Street is an ecosystem that devours the weak. As a black woman in a space dominated by legacy wealth and old boys clubs, you do not survive by asking for permission. You survive by becoming apex. You learn to smell fear. You learn to identify the exact structural weakness in a company's foundation, and you strike when they are over-leveraged and blinded by their own hubris. Caleb and Marcus thought they were apex predators because they wore expensive suits and drank premium bourbon. They were nothing but bottom feeders. They lacked the discipline, the intellect, and the sheer brutality required to actually build an empire. I had allowed them to insult my intelligence because an underestimated opponent is the most dangerous entity in any room. Marcus and Caleb worked as vice presidents at Meridian Wealth Management, a mid-tier bloated financial services firm that catered to old Southern money. Meridian was exactly the kind of firm Caleb thrived in, a place where white privilege was shielded by legacy relationships and where Marcus was kept around as the token black executive to secure the lucrative mega church accounts. But I knew something they did not. Meridian Wealth Management was financially bleeding. Their portfolio yields were stagnant, their management was ancient, and their compliance protocols were practically non-existent. For the past 8 months, Vanguard Capital had been quietly buying up Meridian's distressed debt and accumulating proxy voting rights through secondary markets. It was a classic shadow accumulation. I had personally designed the acquisition strategy from the ground up. identifying every bloated executive salary and every underperforming asset class within their portfolio. Now, with my promotion to managing partner finalized, I had the ultimate authority to greenlight the execution. I was no longer just an analyst presenting a pitch. I was the executioner holding the axe. A hostile takeover is a beautiful, violent maneuver. You do not negotiate with the board of directors. You do not ask the CEO for a friendly merger. You bypass the gatekeepers, completely offering shareholders a premium they cannot refuse, and you seize the controlling interest overnight. You force the target company to surrender its autonomy. But I was not just going to acquire Meridian Wealth Management. I was going to completely liquidate its executive tier. As the acquiring managing partner, my very first executive action would be a comprehensive forensic compliance audit of the entire firm. An audit that would immediately red flag Caleb and Marcus. Arrogant men always make the same fatal mistake. They assume the rules do not apply to them, so they get sloppy. They were using Meridian's corporate servers and client communication channels to orchestrate Caleb's illegal shell company and to facilitate Marcus's extortion payments. The moment Vanguard took control, every email, every wire transfer, every deleted file on their work computers would legally belong to me. I sat back and watched the pieces of their pathetic exit strategy align. Marcus and Caleb had a plan. I could see it as clearly as a balance sheet. They intended to resign from Meridian, cash out their vested stock options, and collect massive executive severance packages. They planned to use that corporate golden parachute to formally launch Caleb's unregistered ghost fund, and to keep Marcus's mistress quiet. It was their ultimate escape hatch, a way to walk away from their corporate failures while appearing like victorious entrepreneurs to their social circle. I was going to weld the hatch shut. Corporate severance packages and vested equity are entirely contingent on clean compliance. If an executive is terminated for cause specifically for gross financial misconduct, embezzlement, or violating federal securities laws, their equity is instantly voided. Their severance is zeroed out. They are stripped of their licenses and they leave with absolutely nothing. By initiating the hostile takeover and triggering the compliance audit, I would unilaterally freeze all of their assets. The money Marcus thought he was going to use to build his fake legacy would be vaporized. The funds Caleb needed to pay off his mounting debts would be locked in a federal holding account. I clicked a single button on my dashboard and authorized the takeover sequence. I typed a highly encrypted email to my acquisition team confirming the execution order. The hostile takeover of Meridian Wealth Management would be finalized and legally binding by the end of the week. The trap was set, armed and completely inescapable, but I was not going to execute them quietly in a boardroom. They had spent 7 years making my life a public spectacle. They had used their church, their wealth, and their social standing to repeatedly humiliate me. They deserved a public execution. Tomorrow night was Pastor Thomas and First Lady Vivian's lavish anniversary gala, a 50-person black tie dinner at their heavily mortgaged mansion. The guest list was a who is who of Atlanta's black elite, filled with politicians, mega church pastors, and wealthy socialites. It was the absolute pinnacle of their fake performative existence. I knew Marcus was planning to use that audience to humiliate me. His bruised ego demanded a spectacle. I knew he was going to announce his bold departure from Meridian to start his own empire alongside Caleb. I knew he was going to publicly demand my financial submission, twisting my hard-earned success into a punchline to secure his position as the dominant patriarch in front of his peers. He thought public pressure would force me to finally break and hand over my assets. I leaned back in my chair, the soft glow of the monitors illuminating my face. I felt a supreme, icy calm wash over me. I was not going to stop him. I was going to let him stand up in front of the entire elite congregation. I was going to let him puff out his chest, deliver his arrogant speech, and burn his own bridges. Because the higher he climbed on his pedestal of lies, the more devastating the impact would be when I completely shattered the ground beneath his feet. I locked my workstation, walked out of my office, and prepared for war. The Atlanta night air was thick with humidity and the cloying scent of expensive perfume as I handed my keys to the valet outside Pastor Thomas and First Lady Vivian's sprawling estate. The mansion sat at the end of a long manicured driveway in Buckhead, illuminated by aggressive landscape lighting designed to ensure every passing car knew exactly how much money supposedly resided within its walls. I stepped out of my vehicle, wearing a floor-length emerald green gown, my posture perfectly straight, my expression entirely unreadable. I was not walking into a celebration. I was walking onto a battlefield to survey the casualties before the war even officially began. I stepped through the massive wrought iron double doors and into the grand foyer. If my eyes were a camera lens, they would have been performing a slow, steady tracking shot across the room, capturing every pathetic detail of their manufactured prestige. The estate was a masterclass in financial delusion. Towering ice sculptures flanked the entrance, melting slowly onto the imported marble floors. A string quartet played classical music in the corner, their faces fixed in polite smiles. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with beluga caviar and glasses of vintage champagne. To the untrained eye, it was a spectacular display of generational wealth and divine blessing. But I did not possess an untrained eye. I am an auditor of reality. I looked at the crystal chandeliers and saw the second mortgage they had taken out to finance their lifestyle. I looked at the towering floral arrangements of rare white orchids and saw the unpaid vendor invoices piling up in the church's administrative office. I looked at the very walls of the estate and saw a heavily leveraged toxic asset teetering on the edge of a massive foreclosure. They were throwing $1 million party using money that simply did not exist. The guest list was a carefully curated exhibition of Atlanta's black elite. Everywhere I looked, I saw local politicians, city council members, and rival megachurch pastors dressed in custom-tailored tuxedos and holding court. These were men and women who treated Sunday service like a networking event, trading business cards and political favors over communion wine. The room buzzed with the loud, performative laughter of people desperate to prove their relevance. They clinked their crystal glasses, completely unaware that they were standing in a sinking ship. I moved through the crowd with the silent grace of a ghost, sipping a glass of sparkling water. I did not engage in small talk, I simply observed. Near the grand sweeping staircase, First Lady Vivian was holding court. She wore a custom beaded silver gown that caught the light with her every movement, projecting the image of a flawless matriarch blessed by divine favor. She was surrounded by a circle of wealthy church donors and local socialites. Her voice carried across the room, loud and dripping with false humility. She was bragging about the church's new community center, casually dropping astronomical financial figures to ensure everyone in earshot knew just how much capital her ministry supposedly controlled. She smiled warmly at a visiting bishop, placing a hand over her heart, playing the role of the humble servant. I analyzed the diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. It was a spectacular piece, blindingly bright. But I had seen the insurance writers on their estate during my background investigations. The diamonds were rented. She did not own them. She was standing in a house she could not afford, wearing jewelry that did not belong to her, boasting about church funds that her son and son-in-law were actively embezzling. It was a breathtaking display of pathological narcissism. A few feet away, standing near the towering champagne pyramid, was Jasmine. My sister-in-law was in her element, thriving in an environment where her only responsibility was to look expensive. She wore a completely sheer designer dress that screamed new money and desperation. She was cornering a group of younger wives, speaking at a volume intended to dominate the space. She laughed shrilly, waving her hand to show off a massive diamond tennis bracelet. She was bragging about her upcoming vacation to the Maldives, detailing the private overwater bungalow Caleb had supposedly booked for them. She spoke about Caleb's financial prowess, as if he were a Wall Street oracle, boasting to the other women about how her husband was managing private equity funds for the city's most elite circles. I watched her with a profound clinical pity. Jasmine had built her entire identity around being the pampered wife of a wealthy white man. She truly believed her proximity to Caleb elevated her above everyone else in the room. She had no idea that her husband was entirely insolvent. She did not know that his trust fund was a lie, that his business was an unregistered ghost ship, and that the credit cards currently funding her lavish lifestyle were about to be declined across the globe. She was standing on a trap door, boasting about the view, completely oblivious to the fact that I held the lever. Caleb stood next to Jasmine, but his demeanor was entirely different. To the casual observer, he looked like the relaxed, confident patriarch. He wore a velvet dinner jacket, his posture seemingly casual as he nodded along to his wife's bragging. But my eyes tracked his micro movements. His jaw was clenched tight. A thin sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead despite the powerful air conditioning. He kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Most tellingly, he was obsessively checking his phone. Every 30 seconds he would pull it from his pocket, stare at the dark screen, and shove it back in. Caleb knew his walls were closing in. He knew the money he had extorted from Marcus was a temporary bandage on a massive arterial bleed. He was waiting for a confirmation wire that was never going to arrive. He looked exactly like a cornered animal trying to blend in at a petting zoo. And then there was Marcus. My husband was working the room like a politician on election night. He was shaking hands with city officials, patting church elders on the back, and laughing with a booming artificial confidence. I wore the bespoke Italian tuxedo I had purchased for him in Milan the previous year. He moved from group to group, actively avoiding making eye contact with me. He was playing the role of the devoted son, the brilliant financial vice president, the man who had it all. He was visibly inflating his own ego, drawing energy from the wealthy crowd, preparing himself for the grand spectacle he had planned for the evening. I thought he was untouchable tonight. He felt insulated by the presence of his parents, his white brother-in-law, and the 50 elite guests who treated him like royalty. He believed that this room filled with Atlanta's high society provided him with absolute leverage over me. He assumed I would shrink into the background, intimidated by the wealth and the social pressure. I stood near a towering marble pillar, perfectly still, letting the noise of the party wash over me. I looked at Marcus smiling and drinking his expensive scotch. I looked at Vivian accepting compliments on her rented diamonds. I looked at Jasmine flaunting a lifestyle funded by extortion. I looked at Caleb sweating through his velvet jacket. They were all feeding off each other's delusions. They had constructed an entire universe built on fraud, manipulation, and unearned arrogance. They believed they were the predators of this city. They truly believed they could steal from me, humiliate me, and leverage my assets without facing a single consequence. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water. The ice clinked softly against the crystal glass. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with the static electricity that precedes a massive destructive storm. I was not angry anymore. The rage had burned away days ago, leaving nothing but cold, absolute execution. I was simply waiting for the opening bell. I was waiting for Marcus to step up to the microphone and dig his own grave in front of the entire city. The clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal champagne flute cut through the low hum of jazz and pretentious chatter. The string quartet immediately ceased playing. Every head in the grand foyer turned toward the sweeping staircase. Marcus stood on the second landing, looking down at the crowd, projecting the manufactured aura of a king addressing his subjects. He held a microphone in one hand and a glass of expensive scotch in the other. "If I could have everyone's attention," Marcus announced. His voice echoed through the vaulted ceilings, smooth and practiced, a cheap imitation of his father's Sunday sermons. "Tonight we are here to celebrate 40 years of holy matrimony between my incredible parents, Pastor Thomas, and First Lady Vivian. They built Greater Hope Ministry from the ground up. They built this family. They built a legacy." The room erupted into polite, synchronized applause. Vivian pressed a hand to her chest, beaming with manufactured humility, while making sure the chandelier light caught her rented diamonds perfectly. Marcus continued walking slowly down the marble steps. "Watching my parents has taught me everything I know about leadership, about faith, and about what it means to be the head of a household. It taught me how to be a provider. And speaking of providing, I want to take a brief moment to acknowledge my own wife, Nia." The spotlight suddenly shifted. 50 pairs of eyes locked onto me. I remained perfectly still by the marble pillar, my expression frozen in a pleasant, unbothered mask. I raised my glass of sparkling water a fraction of an inch, acknowledging the room. "Nia just received a promotion at her firm," Marcus said, his tone dripping with a sudden suffocating patronization. "Managing partner at Vanguard Capital, A few genuine murmurs of impressiveness rippled through the guests. In the financial sector, that title held immense weight. But Marcus quickly raised his free hand to silence the room, his smile twisting into a slick, condescending smirk. Now we all know how the corporate world works these days. Marcus continued, pacing the floor like a stand-up comedian preparing for a punchline. Wall Street is under a lot of pressure to change its image. They are desperate to look progressive. So when they need to fill a diversity quota, they look for someone who fits the demographic perfectly. They look for a black woman from a humble background to put on the corporate brochure to make themselves look good to the public. The silence in the room shifted from attentive to excruciatingly tense. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. He was publicly invalidating a decade of my 80-hour workweeks, my strategic brilliance, and my financial victories. He was reducing my entire existence, my intellect, and my undeniable track record to a corporate public relations stunt. He was telling Atlanta's black elite that my success was not earned, but charitably granted. But I am proud of her, Marcus added quickly, wrapping his insult in a thin veil of fake support. It is cute, it keeps her busy, and it takes a very secure, very successful black man to let his wife play the corporate boss while he handles the real wealth generation for the family. From the center of the room, a loud, booming laugh shattered the tension. It was Caleb. He raised his bourbon glass high in the air, his face flushed with alcohol and arrogant delight. To the diversity quotas! Caleb called out, his voice laced with the sneering privilege of a man who had never faced a closed door in his life. God bless the HR departments for giving the wives a place to go during the day, so we can do the real heavy lifting. The room broke. The tension dissolved into a wave of laughter. Jasmine threw her head back and giggled, leaning into Caleb's shoulder. Vivian offered a tight, approving smile, validating her son's public display of dominance. Pastor Thomas chuckled, nodding his head approvingly. The guests, these supposed pillars of the community, these politicians and church elders, joined in the mockery. They laughed because the pastor's family was laughing. They laughed because in their twisted social hierarchy, aligning with Marcus and Caleb was safer than defending a woman they viewed as a working-class outsider. I stood completely motionless. My heart did not race. My hands did not shake. I held my glass, letting the cold condensation chill my fingertips. I did not look at the floor. I did not blink away tears. I kept my head perfectly level, and I looked at every single person in that room. I cataloged their faces. I noted the city councilman who was currently under investigation for zoning fraud, laughing into his napkin. I registered the rival pastor who secretly funneled church donations into a private offshore account, chuckling at Marcus's joke. I locked eyes with Jasmine, who was grinning with pure, venomous satisfaction. I stared at Caleb, whose counterfeit watch gleamed under the chandelier, projecting the false confidence of a man entirely unaware of the federal snare closing around his neck. And finally I looked at Marcus. He was beaming. His chest was puffed out, soaking in the validation of his white brother-in-law and the sycophantic crowd. He had done it. He had successfully humiliated me to compensate for his own profound insecurities. He had torn down a black woman to prove his worth to a room full of frauds. He thought he had definitively put me in my place. He had no idea that he had just delivered his own eulogy. Psychologically, the display was fascinating. Marcus was projecting his exact reality onto me. He was the one who only had a job because of a quota, the unwritten quota that required white-managed financial firms to keep one well-connected black man on staff to secure minority megachurch funds. He was the token. He was the charity case. I was the predator who actually owned the jungle. I did not interrupt his moment. I let the laughter echo. I wanted him to feel invincible. I wanted him to climb to the absolute highest peak of his delusion, because the fall would be that much more catastrophic. I stood there, an unmoving monument of composure, drinking in their mockery like fuel. They thought my silence was the silence of a defeated woman. It was the silence of a general watching an enemy army march blindly into a minefield. In my mind, I was already drafting the liquidation orders. I was analyzing the exact legal mechanisms I would use to strip Caleb of his brokerage licenses. I was calculating the precise moment the FBI would receive the dossier, containing the evidence of Marcus's embezzlement and his illegal real estate purchases. Every laugh from the crowd was just another signature on their collective death warrant. Marcus raised his glass once more, gesturing for the crowd to settle down. He had delivered his insult and now he was pivoting to the main event. I was preparing the setup for his grand ruinous finale. He was about to announce the fake business venture, the very venture that was currently bleeding his bank accounts dry to pay off his mistress. He took a deep breath, flashing $1 million smile at Caleb, completely oblivious to the financial guillotine swinging straight for his neck. But tonight is not just about celebrating the past 40 years of my parents and their incredible marriage, Marcus declared, his voice dropping an octave to sound more commanding. It is about securing the future. It is about breaking the chains of the corporate plantation and building a legacy that will last for generations. A murmur of intrigued approval rippled through the affluent crowd. Pastor Thomas nodded solemnly from his seat, steepling his fingers as if his son were delivering a sermon. For the past decade, Caleb and I have made millions of dollars for other people. Marcus continued, pacing the landing with the practiced rhythm of a motivational speaker. We have sat in the boardrooms of Meridian Wealth Management and watched the old guard play it safe. We realize that true financial liberation does not come from climbing someone else's ladder. It comes from owning the entire building. Therefore, I am incredibly proud to announce to our closest friends and family that as of 5 o'clock this evening, Caleb and I have officially submitted our resignations to Meridian Wealth Management. The room erupted into surprised gasps, followed by enthusiastic applause. Jasmine squealed with delight, clapping her hands so hard her diamond bracelets clattered together. Caleb raised his glass again, soaking in the admiration of the crowd. They were selling a narrative of bold entrepreneurial bravery. They were presenting themselves as titans of industry, taking a calculated leap of faith. I analyzed the legal implications of what Marcus had just confessed in front of 50 prominent witnesses. By officially submitting their resignations before Vanguard Capital formally executed the hostile takeover, they had unwittingly triggered the voluntary separation clauses in their employment contracts. They believed they were going to quietly cash out their vested stock options and secure their golden parachutes by the end of the week. They thought they had timed their exit perfectly. They had absolutely no idea that voluntary resignation during a pending federal compliance audit automatically froze all outgoing executive payouts. They had just locked themselves out of their own bank accounts. We are launching our own decentralized private equity syndicate, Marcus announced, his chest swelling with unearned pride. Horizon Holdings. We are moving fast. We are bypassing the bloated institutional gatekeepers, and we are going to revolutionize how wealth is managed in this city. He paused, letting the applause die down before turning his gaze directly back to me. His smile sharpened into a weapon. Of course, any great empire requires a strong foundation, Marcus said, locking eyes with me across the room. Every king needs a queen willing to hold the fort while he goes to war. Since I am forfeiting my corporate salary to build this syndicate, our household is going to require some restructuring. Nia, my beautiful, hardworking wife, has graciously agreed to step up. The entire room shifted their attention back to me. The silence was thick, heavy with the weight of social expectation. Since Vanguard Capital so generously gifted her that diversity promotion, her new salary is going to keep our lights on, Marcus declared publicly, completely ignoring the fact that I had never agreed to any such thing. She is going to cover the household expenses, handle the capital calls, and finance our operational costs until Horizon Holdings matures. She is going to put her little corporate paycheck to good use and fund the real wealth generation of this family. Howe was cornering me. Howe was using the social pressure of Atlanta's elite to extort me. He knew that in their culture, a wife publicly contradicting her husband at a major family event was the ultimate sin. He thought I would be too paralyzed by the fear of causing a scene to deny his claims. He thought I would simply smile, nod, and accept the financial yoke he was forcing onto my shoulders to save face in front of the congregation. And then he went in for the kill. In fact, Marcus continued, his voice projecting clearly to every corner of the grand foyer, Nia has shown such incredible faith in our vision that she is putting up her premarital townhouse as collateral. She is leveraging her personal property to ensure our initial capital phase is fully funded. That is what a real Black woman does for her man. She provides the bridge and she does not complain about the wait. My mother-in-law Vivian immediately clasped her hands together in a theatrical display of holy gratitude. Praise the Lord, Vivian called out loudly, making sure the visiting bishops and city council members heard her. The book of Proverbs tells us that a wise woman builds her house. By submitting her finances to her husband's God-given vision, Nia is finally learning how to build hers. It is a beautiful thing to see a woman step down from her pride and submit to the spiritual head of her family. Jasmine leaned against Caleb, her laughter high and grating. It is about time you made yourself useful to the family legacy, Nia. You can pack your own lunches for a while and cancel your little shopping trips. Caleb and Marcus are building an empire. The least you can do is pay the utility bills while they do the real work. Caleb took a slow, arrogant sip of his bourbon. He looked at me with a gaze so deeply patronizing it practically radiated white supremacy. It takes a strong woman to hold the ladder while the men climb. Nia. Caleb said, his voice carrying easily across the silent room. Do not worry. When we take Horizon Holdings to $1 billion valuation, we will make sure you get a nice little allowance for your loyalty. We appreciate your contribution to the Caleb and Marcus vision. The sheer breathtaking audacity of their performance was almost hypnotic. They were standing in a foreclosed mansion, drowning in debt, actively embezzling funds, and facing imminent federal prosecution. Yet they were publicly humiliating me, demanding my property, and attempting to enslave me financially to cover the cost of Marcus's mistress and Caleb's blackmail scheme. They were demanding I finance the very knife they were using to stab me in the back. The guests looked at me, their faces a mixture of pity and smug approval. They fully expected me to bow my head. They expected me to offer a demure, obedient smile and verbally confirm my submission to my husband's grand plan. In their world, women were nothing more than decorative accessories and financial safety nets for the men who claimed to lead them. I did not bow my head. I did not smile. I took one final deliberate sip of my sparkling water. I set the crystal glass down on a silver tray held by a passing waiter. The soft clink of the glass was the only sound I made. I looked at Marcus, who was grinning down at me from the staircase, reveling in his perceived victory. I looked at Caleb, who was adjusting his counterfeit watch with an air of absolute invincibility. They had laid out their entire strategy. They had publicly bound themselves to a fraudulent company, voluntarily resigned from their only sources of legitimate income, and openly confessed to their financial reliance on my assets. They had constructed their own trap, walked directly into the center of it, and handed me the remote control. I did not feel a single ounce of fear. I felt the cold, mechanical precision of an executioner stepping up to the block. I slowly reached into the pocket of my emerald green gown. My fingers wrapped around the cold metal of my phone. The device felt heavy, loaded with the encrypted dossier, the financial routing numbers, the deed to Chloe Summers's luxury condominium, and the direct contact information for the compliance authorities. I pulled the phone out and unlocked the screen. The glow of the display illuminated my face in the dim atmospheric lighting of the grand foyer. Marcus's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He noticed the complete absence of submission in my posture. He noticed the predatory stillness in my eyes. The triumphant energy in the room began to shift, dropping slightly, as the guests registered that I was not reacting according to their social script. I did not raise my voice. I did not address the crowd. I simply tapped a contact name on my screen and pressed the call button. The silence in the room was so absolute that the ringing of the phone on speaker mode echoed clearly against the marble floors. 1 ring, 2 rings. On the 3rd ring, the line connected. Yes, managing partner, a sharp professional voice answered through the speaker. It was Robert, the chief legal officer and head of global compliance at Vanguard Capital. The title managing partner hung in the air, instantly changing the atmospheric pressure of the room. The smug smirk vanished from Caleb's face. Marcus gripped the microphone tighter, his knuckles turning white. Vivian stopped beaming. They thought they had stripped me of my power. They were about to find out that I was the only person in the room who possessed any power at all. Robert, I am initiating Directive 44. I said, my voice steady, slicing through the dead silence of the grand foyer. The air in the room grew instantly heavy. Directive 44 was not a standard corporate procedure. In the highest echelons of Wall Street, it is the nuclear option. It is the immediate unconditional lockdown of an acquired asset to prevent executives from liquidating funds or destroying evidence before a federal audit. Understood, managing partner. Robert replied the speakerphone, projecting his crisp clinical tone to the 50 elite guests standing completely frozen around me. Standing by for specific target parameters. Marcus gripped the microphone on the stairs, his initial confusion rapidly morphing into anger. Nia, what kind of stunt is this? Put the phone down, you are making a fool of yourself. I did not even blink in his direction. I kept my eyes locked on Caleb, watching the blood completely drain from his face. Caleb understood what was happening. He might have been a fraud, but he knew enough corporate terminology to recognize the sound of the reaper sharpening his scythe. Robert, I continued, enunciating every syllable with lethal precision. Execute the immediate hostile takeover of Meridian Wealth Management. The board of directors has been bypassed. We now hold the controlling proxy. I want their corporate headquarters locked down by our private security contractors effective 5 minutes ago. No one enters, no one leaves, and no digital assets are to be altered. A collective gasp swept through the crowd of politicians, pastors, and socialites. They were witnessing a live corporate assassination. Jasmine dropped her champagne glass. It shattered against the marble floor, but nobody looked away from me. Takeover sequence activated, Robert confirmed calmly. Network servers are currently being seized. Security is on site, awaiting personnel directives. Now I want you to isolate 2 specific executives, I said, taking a slow, measured step toward the staircase where Marcus stood paralyzed. I want the immediate termination with cause for Marcus Thomas, Vice President of Client Relations, and Caleb Sterling, Senior Director of Private Equity. Revoke their building access, disable their corporate emails, and remotely wipe their company-issued devices. Caleb lunged forward, nearly knocking over a waiter. Nia, shut up. Hang up that phone right now. You do not have the authority to do this. We resigned. We already submitted our resignations to Human Resources. I smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp expression that stopped him dead in his tracks. That brings me to my next point, Robert, I said into the phone. Both of these men submitted voluntary resignations this afternoon. However, due to the pending federal compliance audit triggered by our takeover, those resignations are classified as attempts to flee gross financial misconduct. Therefore, void their golden parachutes, cancel all exit payouts, terminate their health benefits, and most importantly, zero out their vested stock options. They leave with absolutely nothing, not a single cent. Marcus actually dropped the microphone. It hit the marble steps with a loud, deafening screech of feedback that made several guests cover their ears. He stumbled down 2 steps, his meticulously crafted, arrogant facade completely dissolving into raw, unfiltered panic. You cannot do that, Marcus shouted, his voice cracking. That is my money. I earned that equity. I am the head of this family. You cannot touch my accounts. I ignored his pathetic outburst entirely. My focus remained entirely on the kill shot. Robert, I have just transmitted a highly encrypted dossier to your secure inbox. The password is my maternal grandmother's maiden name. Inside that file you will find irrefutable proof of embezzlement, wire fraud, and extortion. Caleb Sterling established an unregistered illegal shell company named Vanguard Horizon Holdings, LLC. He used this fraudulent entity to bypass federal securities laws and extort $150,000 from my joint savings account. Vivienne let out a strangled cry, clutching her rented diamond necklace as if she were having a heart attack. The wealthy church donors standing around her instinctively took a step back, suddenly eager to distance themselves from the pastor's family. In high society, financial scandal is highly contagious, and nobody wanted to catch the disease I was currently exposing. Furthermore, I continued raising my voice just enough to ensure every single person in the mansion heard the exact nature of their crimes. Marcus Thomas willingly facilitated this wire fraud to purchase a luxury condominium in Midtown Atlanta for his mistress, an individual named Chloe Summers, who happens to be Caleb Sterling's former assistant. Caleb has been using this affair to blackmail Marcus, forcing him to launder money to cover Caleb's own catastrophic personal debts. Jasmine let out a blood-curdling scream. She spun around and shoved Caleb hard in the chest. You blackmailed my brother. You used his mistress to steal money from his wife. You told me your trust fund was tied up in probate. You told me we were rich. Caleb tried to grab her hands, his face slick with sweat. Jasmine, baby, calm down. She is lying. She is a bitter, jealous woman making up numbers to ruin us. It is a bluff. It is not a bluff, Robert's voice echoed through my phone speaker, cutting through Caleb's frantic lies. Managing partner, the dossier has been received and decrypted. The wire transfers, the deed of trust, and the geolocation metadata are all verified. Excellent, I said. Robert, draft the formal criminal complaint. I want this dossier submitted directly to our contacts at the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, and the White Collar Crime Division of the FBI. Do not wait for Monday morning. Call the regional director at home. Tell them we have a live case of interstate wire fraud and extortion. Copy that, managing partner. FBI liaison is being contacted now. The accounts are frozen. The equity is zeroed. Meridian Wealth Management is officially under your control. Is there anything else that will be all, Robert? I will see you in the boardroom on Monday. I ended the call. The silence that fell over the grand foyer was absolute and suffocating. The string quartet had fled. The catering staff had backed against the walls. The 50 elite guests stood frozen, their mouths slightly open, staring at me as if I had just summoned fire from the sky. I slipped my phone back into the pocket of my emerald green gown. I stood perfectly straight, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle from my skirt. I felt incredibly light, as if gravity had ceased to apply to me. I had walked into this house as the marginalized working-class daughter-in-law. I had just dismantled their entire financial ecosystem in less than 3 minutes without raising my voice or breaking a sweat. Marcus was gripping the banister of the staircase, gasping for air. His bespoke Italian tuxedo suddenly looked like a cheap Halloween costume. The realization of his total ruin was crashing down on him in real time. He had no job. He had no severance. His affair was public knowledge. His elite reputation was obliterated, and the federal government was about to seize his remaining assets. Caleb was frantically tapping on his counterfeit Patek Philippe watch, staring at his phone screen as if trying to will a different reality into existence. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, terrifying shade of pale. He knew the FBI did not play games with wire fraud. He knew that unregistered securities carried mandatory federal prison sentences. The arrogant white privilege that had shielded him his entire life was completely useless against a digital paper trail of his own crimes. Vivienne was leaning heavily against Pastor Thomas, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror, the First Lady of Greater Hope Ministry. The woman who had demanded my submission and called me Baron was now watching her golden son and her wealthy son-in-law face federal indictment in front of her most important donors. Her meticulously curated empire of faith and fashion had just been exposed as a den of thieves. I looked at Marcus. He was staring at me, his eyes wide and pleading. He opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to try to assert his dominance one last time. But before he could utter a single pathetic word, the silence in the grand foyer was broken by a sound far more devastating than my voice. It was a chorus of digital notifications. It started with one phone buzzing in Caleb's pocket. Then Marcus's phone chimed from his jacket. Then Jasmine's phone rang from her designer clutch. Within seconds, a cacophony of alerts, rings, and vibrations erupted from the pockets and purses of the 4 people who had tried to destroy me. The automated systems of Wall Street operate with merciless speed. The fallout had officially reached their devices, and the avalanche of their destruction was about to bury them alive. Caleb snatched his phone from his pocket with trembling hands. His thumb frantically swiped across the glowing glass. I watched the artificial tan completely drain from his face, replaced by an ashen, sickly gray. His eyes darted back and forth, reading the incoming notifications. The first was an automated email from the Vanguard Capital Human Resources Division. I knew exactly what it said because I had authorized the template myself. It was the formal notice of termination with cause. It cited the exact corporate bylaws he had violated, stripped him of his federal securities licenses, and formally banned him from the premises of any Meridian Wealth Management building. Before Caleb could even process the termination, his screen went entirely black. The Vanguard Information Technology Department had initiated the remote wipe protocol. Caleb's company issued phone. The device he had used to coordinate his entire fraudulent empire was suddenly nothing more than a useless brick of metal. He mashed the power button, his breathing turning into shallow, rapid gasps. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a ledge and realized gravity was real. Marcus was next. He stared at his personal device, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped it on the marble floor. A cascade of push notifications flooded his lock screen, each one a separate catastrophic financial blow. American Express account suspended. Chase private client access revoked. Federal holding alerts triggered on his primary, checking his savings and the joint accounts he thought he had successfully drained. The banks were not just freezing his assets, they were actively flagging his identity for massive financial fraud. And then came the message that completely broke him. A text from Chloe Summers illuminated his screen. I did not need to see the display to know what she was frantically typing. I had made sure the Vanguard legal team slapped an immediate corporate lien on the Midtown condominium an hour before I arrived at the party. Since the property was purchased with embezzled corporate funds, it was legally classified as a seized asset. Chloe was not just losing her luxury apartment, she was actively being escorted off the premises by corporate recovery agents. Marcus was reading the panicked, furious messages of his mistress, realizing she was homeless and implicated in a federal crime. Jasmine let out a piercing, hysterical shriek. She was staring at her own phone, furiously tapping the screen with her manicured nails. Her platinum credit cards, entirely funded by Caleb's non-existent trust, and Marcus's stolen money, were failing. She was receiving real-time notifications of declined transactions. Her luxury SUV lease payment bounced. Her exclusive country club membership triggered an automatic suspension alert. The financial safety net she had weaponized against me for 7 years evaporated in a matter of seconds. My cards are declining! Jasmine screamed, her voice cracking as she shoved the screen into Caleb's chest. Caleb, what did you do? Why is the bank texting me about a fraud lock? You said we had millions in the offshore account. The 50 guests in the grand foyer were no longer a supportive audience. They had transformed into a ruthless jury. The whispers started immediately growing into a harsh, buzzing hive of judgment. I saw the city councilman subtly signal his wife to head for the coat check, desperate to avoid any association with a looming federal indictment. The rival megachurch pastor pulled out his phone, likely texting his own board of directors to immediately sever all financial ties with Greater Hope Ministry. In the world of Atlanta's black elite, proximity to white-collar crime is absolute social suicide. They were abandoning Pastor Thomas and First Lady Vivian with terrifying speed. The air in the room was thick with the scent of fear. Guests began edging toward the heavy oak doors, their eyes glued to the spectacle unfolding on the grand staircase. Several of the younger socialites had their phones out, openly recording the downfall of the city's most arrogant family. The perfect, untouchable facade of the Thomas legacy was bleeding out on the imported marble floor. Marcus looked up from his phone, his eyes bloodshot and wild with pure terror. He lunged toward Caleb, grabbing the lapels of Caleb's velvet dinner jacket. You told me we were safe, Marcus roared, his voice completely devoid of the smooth confidence he had projected minutes earlier. You said setting up the shell company would hide the money from the auditors. You promised me she would never find out about Chloe. You said you had the compliance officers in your pocket. Caleb shoved Marcus away with a violent thrust, his own panic stripping away his polished upper-class facade. The illusion of their brotherhood shattered instantly. Caleb was no longer the mentoring brother-in-law sharing his wealth. He was a cornered rat turning on his accomplice. Get your hands off me, you idiot! Caleb shouted, looking frantically around the room at the guests who were capturing his every move on camera. I told you to keep your wife under control. I told you she was going to be a problem. This is your fault for marrying a street rat who does not know her place. You were supposed to manage her, but you are too weak to handle a woman who makes more money than you. Jasmine gasped, grabbing Caleb's arm. Do not talk to my brother like that. You told us you were a financial genius. You told us Vanguard Capital was full of dinosaurs we could easily outmaneuver. Caleb turned his rage on his wife, his face twisting into an ugly, cruel snarl. Shut up, Jasmine. You do not know anything about how this world works. You just spend the money. You think your little sorority connections matter when the Securities and Exchange Commission is knocking on the door. You are just as useless as he is. The racism and misogyny. Caleb had carefully masked with fake charm and expensive gifts, finally boiled over. He was a man who believed his whiteness made him invincible, and facing the reality that a black woman had systematically outsmarted him broke his mind. Vivian rushed forward, placing herself between Marcus and Caleb, her silver-beaded gown shimmering wildly. She raised her hands, trying to project the holy authority she used to command her congregation. "Stop this right now!" Vivian ordered, her voice trembling. "Everyone is looking at us. We are a family of God. The enemy is trying to divide us. We need to pray and present a united front." "Thomas, do something." Pastor Thomas stepped forward, but he looked like a deflated balloon. The booming voice he used to demand tithes from the pulpit was completely gone. He looked at the fleeing guests, realizing his entire empire of faith was crumbling. His congregation would demand a full accounting of the church finances the moment the news broke. He knew that the missing funds Marcus had funneled to Caleb would inevitably lead federal investigators directly to the church's ledger. "Nia," Pastor Thomas pleaded, looking at me with a desperate, calculating gaze. "Please, we can fix this. You are part of this family. If Marcus goes down, your name gets dragged through the mud too. Cancel the directive. Tell your legal team it was a misunderstanding. We will give you whatever you want. We will make you the chief financial officer of the church." I looked at the man who had spent 7 years treating me like a disposable accessory. He was trying to negotiate with a loaded gun pointed at his head. He still believed he had something I wanted. He still thought I craved a seat at their miserable, corrupt table. I took a slow step forward, my heels clicking sharply against the floor. The remaining guests held their breath. Marcus fell to his knees on the staircase, openly weeping, clutching his useless phone, as if it could magically reverse the devastation. Jasmine was sobbing into her hands, the reality of her impending bankruptcy finally setting in. "I do not negotiate with criminals, Thomas," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the grand foyer, "and I certainly do not accept bribes from a fake pastor who uses his congregation as a personal piggy bank. There is no misunderstanding. There is only the absolute, undeniable truth. And the truth is going to put your son and your son-in-law in a federal penitentiary." The dominoes were not just falling. They were crashing into each other with violent, unstoppable momentum, setting off a chain reaction that would obliterate every single lie they had ever told. The execution was flawless and the carnage was beautiful. I reached into my emerald green designer clutch. It was custom made and slightly oversized for a standard evening bag, designed specifically to carry the physical manifestation of their total ruin. I pulled out a thick, tightly bound manila folder. I walked deliberately away from the marble pillar and stepped toward the center of the grand foyer, right up to the massive mahogany table holding their towering anniversary cake. I tossed the folder onto the polished wood. It landed with a heavy, definitive smack that echoed over the pathetic, quiet sobs of my husband and my sister-in-law. I looked directly at First Lady Vivian. Her eyes were darting around the room, frantic and wild, searching for a way to spin this disaster into a story of spiritual warfare or demonic testing. I was not going to give her the chance to find her footing. "Open it, Vivian," I commanded. My voice was no longer a whisper, but a sharp, authoritative order that demanded absolute compliance. "Open it and read exactly what your golden son has been doing while you were busy preaching to your congregation about the virtues of a submissive wife." Vivian hesitated. Her hands were shaking so badly that her rented diamond bracelets clattered against the mahogany table. She reached out and flipped open the heavy cover. Pastor Thomas leaned in closely beside her, his breathing shallow and rapid. Caleb stared from a distance, completely paralyzed, his feet glued to the floor because he knew exactly what was inside that folder. The very first document was the deed of trust for the luxury condominium in Midtown Atlanta. I had highlighted the purchase price of $150,000 and the name of the sole owner in bright yellow ink. "That is the Bridge Capital," Marcus was so desperate to secure, I announced, ensuring my voice carried to the remaining guests, who were huddled near the coat check, recording the entire spectacle on their smartphones. That is the decentralized equity fund Caleb promised would revolutionize your family wealth. It is not a commercial real estate asset. It is a luxury apartment purchased outright for Caleb's former 24-year-old assistant Chloe Summers. Vivian stared at the paper, her breath catching audibly in her throat. She frantically flipped to the next page. It was a series of high-resolution date-stamped photographs I had sourced from a private investigator within 48 hours of discovering the missing money. The images were undeniable. The first photo showed Marcus wearing the exact navy blue windowpane suit I had purchased for him in Milan, wrapping his arm around Chloe in the lobby of that very condominium building. Another photo showed them kissing passionately outside an upscale Buckhead steakhouse. I watched the remaining color completely drain from Vivian's face. The wholly untouchable matriarch of Greater Hope Ministry was staring at high-definition proof that her son was a liar, an adulterer, and an absolute fool. The facade she had spent 40 years building was crumbling onto the table right in front of her. But an affair is just a moral failing. I continued, my tone analytical and razor-sharp. In your Vivian, moral failings can be swept under the rug with a tearful Sunday sermon and a few well-placed prayers. So let us move on to the actual crimes. Turn to the third page. Pastor Thomas reached down with a trembling hand and flipped the page himself. He was looking at a forensic flowchart I had personally mapped out. It detailed the exact routing numbers from his church youth fund accounts, connecting directly to the joint savings account Marcus shared with me, and finally funneling straight into Vanguard Horizon Holdings LLC. I pointed at the center of the chart. That is Caleb's unregistered shell company. Caleb discovered your son sleeping with his assistant 6 months ago. But instead of telling his wife, instead of defending the sanctity of your precious family, Caleb saw a financial opportunity. Caleb is completely broke. His trust fund is a mirage. He is drowning in debt. So he blackmailed your son. He forced Marcus to embezzle church funds and drain my personal savings to buy that condo to keep the mistress quiet. Caleb engineered the entire fake startup to launder the extortion money and keep Marcus on a permanent leash. Jasmine let out another piercing scream, burying her face in her hands. She collapsed against a marble pillar, sliding down to the floor, her sheer designer dress pooling around her in a pathetic heap. Her white knight, the wealthy sage she had used to belittle me for 7 years, was nothing but a broke, manipulative extortionist who had leveraged her own brother's infidelity to pay his credit card bills. Marcus remained on his knees on the staircase, weeping uncontrollably, begging for his mother to look at him. "Mom, please," Marcus sobbed, reaching a hand out toward Vivian. "It was a mistake. Caleb forced me. He said he would tell you and Dad. He said he would ruin the church. I was just trying to protect our family." Vivienne slowly looked up from the dossier. The transformation in her face was terrifying. The panicked, praying mother was completely gone. In her place was a cold, calculating narcissist whose entire kingdom had just been set on fire. She did not look at Marcus with maternal forgiveness. She looked at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. He had not just sinned. He had committed the ultimate crime in her eyes. He had gotten caught, and he had exposed her to public humiliation in front of Atlanta's elite. "You absolute fool," Vivian hissed, her voice venomous and harsh. "You weak, pathetic fool. You handed the keys to our ministry to a white con artist because you could not keep your pants zipped. You have destroyed everything Thomas and I spent 40 years building." Marcus flinched as if she had physically struck him. He curled into himself on the stairs, utterly broken, realizing that his mother's unconditional love was entirely conditional on his ability to make her look good. Pastor Thomas gripped the edge of the mahogany table, gasping for air. The financial documents in front of him were a death sentence. He knew that when the FBI audited the church youth fund, they would not just find Marcus's embezzlement. They would find decades of Thomas and Vivian's own financial mismanagement, the skimming, the luxury car leases, disguised as church expenses, the private jet flights written off as mission trips. The dossier I dropped on that table was the thread that was going to unravel their entire fraudulent existence. I stepped closer to the table, looking directly into Vivian's eyes. You brought me into your library earlier today, I said softly, but with enough force to cut through the quiet sobbing in the room. You told me that a woman of God stands behind her husband. You demanded that I sign over my premarital home to fund this exact extortion scheme. You called me barren. You called me trash. You told me I had the stench of the projects on me. Vivienne could not maintain eye contact. She looked down at her shaking hands, entirely stripped of her fake piety and her unearned authority. You thought your status made you untouchable, I continued. You thought you could use my hard-earned wealth to clean up your son's messes. But your son is a coward, your son-in-law is a criminal, and your entire empire is a mirage. I am not the trash in this room, Vivienne. I am the only one who actually owns the clothes on my back. The guests who had not yet fled were capturing every second of this destruction on their phones. I knew the footage would be circulating in group chats and local blogs before I even reached my car. The social execution was absolute. There would be no recovery from this. There would be no public relations spin, no Sunday morning redemption tours, no tearful magazine interviews. The evidence was physical, it was irrefutable, and it was currently sitting in the inbox of federal regulators. I had systematically dismantled every pillar of their lives. I had taken Marcus's career. I had exposed Caleb's blackmail. I had destroyed Jasmine's fake superiority. And I had shattered the untouchable image of Pastor Thomas and First Lady Vivienne. I had placed a mirror in front of their entire family, forcing them to look at the ugly, rotting core of their existence. All their excuses shattered into dust, leaving nothing behind but the cold, harsh reality of their impending ruin. The harsh reality of their impending ruin hung in the air for only a fraction of a second before the silence was violently shattered. Caleb snapped. The polished velvet-draped venture capitalist vanished entirely, replaced by the panicked, cornered criminal he truly was. He ran, a trembling hand through his perfectly styled hair, ruining the expensive cut. The unearned confidence that had defined his entire existence evaporated, leaving behind a frantic, sweaty desperation. He looked at his ruined phone, then looked down at Marcus, who was still kneeling on the marble staircase in tears. Caleb let out a harsh barking laugh. It was a manic, breathless sound that echoed terribly against the vaulted ceilings. "You absolute worthless token!" Caleb spat, his voice cracking with rage. Marcus jolted his tear-streaked face, snapping up to look at his brother-in-law. "Do not talk to me like that," Marcus shouted weakly, trying to stand up but stumbling against the banister. "I will talk to you however I want," Caleb roared, dropping his broken phone onto the floor. "I spoon-fed you the easiest laundering structure in the history of finance. All you had to do was keep your mouth shut, keep your zipper closed, and let me handle the adults. But you could not even do that. You left a digital trail so wide a first-year accounting student could find it. You dragged me into a federal indictment because you are too incredibly stupid to function without someone holding your hand. Do not speak to my son that way in my house." Vivienne shrieked, her maternal instincts momentarily overriding her terror. "You are a guest here. You are a criminal who preyed on our ministry and corrupted my boy. Your ministry! Your house!" Caleb turned his furious gaze onto my mother-in-law, completely abandoning any remaining shred of social etiquette. "Please, Vivienne, do not play the righteous victim with me. You are a fake plastic fraud wearing rented diamonds in a foreclosed mansion. I did not corrupt your son. He was already a spineless coward when I met him. And I did not prey on your ministry. I exploited the exact same gullible flock of sheep you have been bleeding dry for decades." The remaining guests gasped audibly. Several wealthy donors took immediate steps toward the exit, desperately trying to distance themselves from the implosion. The cell phone cameras were still recording, capturing every vile, unfiltered word pouring out of Caleb's mouth. "You people make me sick!" Caleb snarled, his face twisting into an ugly, hateful sneer. The mask of the progressive, wealthy white ally completely melted away, exposing the deep, rotting core of his racism. "You are so utterly obsessed with your proximity to whiteness. You are so incredibly desperate to prove you belong in high society that you let me walk right through the front door and take whatever I wanted. You practically handed me the keys to your bank accounts because I look the part and I know the right words. You wanted my validation so badly that you never even bothered to ask for a single financial credential. Jasmine let out a broken, agonizing sob. She crawled across the marble floor and grabbed the hem of Caleb's trousers. Caleb, stop. Please stop. We are your family. Caleb looked down at his wife with a gaze so devoid of affection it sent a chill through the grand foyer. He kicked his leg out, shaking off her grasp as if she were an infectious disease. Family! You were a prop, Jasmine. Caleb spat his words, slicing through her like a scalpel. A loud, expensive, incredibly naive prop. Do you honestly think I married you because I respected you? Do you think I actually enjoyed listening to your mindless country club gossip? I married you because your father had a database of 10,000 wealthy, faithful donors who would blindly invest their retirement funds with anyone the pastor endorsed. You were just the entry fee, and frankly, you were vastly overpaid for the service. Jasmine collapsed entirely, pressing her face against the cold floor, her wails echoing off the walls, her entire universe and identity built entirely on being chosen by a wealthy white man was completely annihilated in less than 30 seconds. Caleb paced the floor, pacing like a caged predator, realizing the trap had closed. He pointed a shaking finger at Pastor Thomas, then at Vivian, and finally at Marcus. Look at yourselves! Caleb yelled, his voice echoing with pure, unadulterated supremacy. You play dress up, you buy the Italian suits and the European cars, and you host these ridiculous overpriced galas trying to mimic old money. But underneath all the designer labels and the fancy church titles, you are nothing but a cheap minstrel show. You are a ghetto masquerade. You are a joke, and you dragged me down into the mud with you. The words hung in the air like a physical blow. The absolute unvarnished racism that had been lurking beneath his fake progressive smile was finally dragged into the blinding light. I stood by the mahogany table, watching the psychological devastation unfold with cold, clinical satisfaction. For 7 years, Vivian and Jasmine had worshipped Caleb. They had weaponized his whiteness to put me down. They had used his supposed trust fund aesthetic as a benchmark to measure my worth. They had treated me like an outsider because I came from a working-class black neighborhood, choosing to elevate a white con artist simply because society conditioned them to believe his skin color equated to superiority. Now the very idol they had placed on a pedestal was looking down at them and calling them trash. He was using the exact same racist tropes they had spent their entire lives trying to outrun. The poetic justice of their destruction was absolute. They were being torn apart by the monster they had invited into their home and fed at my expense. Marcus let out a guttural, furious roar. Driven by a sudden, pathetic burst of adrenaline, he lunged down the stairs toward Caleb. He threw a wild, uncoordinated punch aimed at Caleb's jaw. But Marcus was not a fighter. He was a pampered executive who had never faced physical confrontation in his life. Caleb easily dodged the blow, grabbed Marcus by the collar of his custom tuxedo, and shoved him violently backward. Marcus tripped over his own feet and crashed into the towering champagne pyramid. Hundreds of crystal glasses shattered in a spectacular, deafening explosion. Expensive champagne rained down on Marcus as he lay groaning amid the broken glass, his hands bleeding, his dignity entirely erased. Caleb did not even look back at him. He turned his wild, desperate eyes toward me. He pointed a finger at my face, breathing heavily. You think you won. Caleb seethed, his chest heaving. You think destroying us makes you one of us. You are just an angry, vindictive woman who got lucky with a few spreadsheets. When the feds come, I will cut a deal. I will roll over on Marcus and Thomas so fast their heads will spin. I am a first-time non-violent offender from a good neighborhood. I have real lawyers. I will walk away from this with probation, and you will still just be a diversity hire. I did not flinch. I offered him a slow, terrifying smile. You do not have lawyers, Caleb, I stated, my voice cutting through his delusional rant with absolute authority. Your accounts are frozen. The retainer for your high-priced legal team was paid using funds routed through Vanguard Horizon Holdings LLC, which means those assets are already seized by the federal government under civil asset forfeiture laws. Caleb's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The realization hit him like a freight train. You are not a first-time offender. I continued, stepping closer so he could see the absolute certainty in my eyes. You crossed state lines to initiate fraudulent wire transfers. You engaged in corporate extortion. You operated an unregistered securities syndicate. You are facing a mandatory minimum of 20 years in federal prison. And no prosecutor is going to offer a plea deal to the mastermind of the operation when they already have all the forensic evidence they need. You are not going to walk away, Caleb. You are going to wear a jumpsuit for the rest of your natural life. Caleb stared at me, his eyes wide with absolute consuming terror. He looked at the shattered glass, he looked at his sobbing wife, and he looked at the open front doors of the mansion. He did not say another word. He turned and sprinted. He shoved his way past the few remaining guests in the foyer, abandoned his wife on the floor, and bolted out the front doors into the humid Atlanta night. He was running from a federal indictment that was already waiting for him. I turned my gaze back to the ruins of the Thomas family. Jasmine was weeping into the marble. Marcus was bleeding amid the shattered crystal. Pastor Thomas was clutching his chest, staring blankly at the ceiling. And First Lady Vivian was kneeling on the floor, her pristine white gown soaked in spilled champagne, looking at the wreckage of her fake, pathetic empire. The elite facade had collapsed completely from the inside out, and I was the only one left standing. The heavy, suffocating silence of the grand foyer was broken only by the sound of dripping champagne and Jasmine's ragged breathing. I remained in the center of the room, completely untouched by the wreckage. Vivian slowly pulled herself up from the marble floor. Her pristine white gown was ruined, stained with alcohol and defeat. She looked at Marcus shivering in the glass, then at the open doors where Caleb had fled. Finally, her eye locked onto me. The arrogance that had defined her entire existence was completely gone. She scrambled toward me, her heels slipping on the wet floor until she was standing just inches away. She reached out with trembling hands, desperately grabbing the fabric of my emerald green gown. "Nia, please, Vivian," sobbed her voice, a pathetic, high-pitched whine that stripped away every ounce of her fabricated pastoral dignity. "You have made your point. You have shown us your power. But please, I am begging you as a mother. Do not send my son to prison. Do not let the federal government seize our church. We will lose everything. The congregation will be destroyed. Have mercy on us, Nia. You are a woman of God. We are your family." I looked down at her hands clutching my dress. I did not pull away immediately. I let her hold on, letting her feel the absolute desperation of begging a woman she had spent 7 years treating like garbage. "Let go of my dress, Vivian," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the absolute authority of a judge delivering a death sentence. She released the fabric, instantly shrinking back as if I had burned her. "Do not dare invoke God to me right now." I continued my gaze, locking her in place. "You did not care about mercy when you dragged me into your library and demanded I sign away my home to fund a scam. You did not care about family when you allowed your son to funnel my savings to his mistress. You built a ministry on extortion and vanity, and you used the pulpit to look down on people who actually worked for a living. You are not a woman of God. You are a parasite wearing a cross." Pastor Thomas finally found his voice. He pushed himself off the mahogany table, looking like a hollow shell of a man. "Nia, we can make restitution. We can sell the assets. We can quietly transfer the church leadership. Just give us time to restructure the debt so we can keep the estate. We can sell the house and pay you back every cent Marcus took." I let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a sound devoid of any humor, a cold strike of absolute finality. "You cannot sell this house, Thomas," I stated, turning to face him, "because you do not own it, and you never did." Vivian's eyes went wide. "What are you talking about? We have a mortgage. We have equity. You had a highly toxic, over-leveraged commercial balloon loan that you took out using fraudulent church collateral." I corrected, breaking down their financial ruin into elementary terms, so even they could understand it. "A loan that went into default 3 months ago. Your lenders were preparing to initiate foreclosure proceedings on Monday morning, but they will not be doing that anymore." I reached into my clutch one last time and pulled out a single folded sheet of heavy stock paper. I held it up so the entire room could see the official bank seal at the top. "When I initiated the takeover of Meridian Wealth Management, I also authorized Vanguard Capital to purchase a portfolio of distressed high-risk debt in the Atlanta area. I personally reviewed the ledger. I bought the promissory note to this estate for pennies on the dollar. Marcus stopped groaning in the glass. Jasmine looked up from the floor. Vivian covered her mouth with both hands, a fresh wave of absolute terror washing over her face. "I am your bank, Vivian," I said, stepping closer to her, ensuring she heard every single syllable. "I own the debt. I own the title. I own the very floor you are kneeling on. And since the terms of your original loan included a strict acceleration clause for fraudulent activity, I am calling the debt entirely due, immediately." "No," Vivian gasped, shaking her head violently. "No, you cannot do this. This is our home. This is where we host the ministry. You cannot take our home." "It is not a home. It is a crime scene," I replied coldly. "And I am not taking it. I am reclaiming my capital. I am evicting you." I looked at my watch. The counterfeit Patek Caleb wore was a cheap imitation, but the timepiece on my wrist was authentic and precise. "It is currently 10 o'clock on Saturday night," I announced, projecting my voice, so Marcus, Jasmine, Thomas, and Vivian heard it simultaneously. "You have exactly 24 hours to vacate my property. By 10 o'clock tomorrow evening, I expect this house to be completely empty. You can take your personal clothing and whatever dignity you have left. Every piece of furniture, every piece of art, and every vehicle parked in that driveway that was purchased with church funds remains on site for the federal liquidators." Marcus tried to push himself up, his hands smeared with blood and champagne. "Nia, where are we supposed to go? We have no money. Our cards are frozen. We do not have anywhere to sleep." I looked down at my soon-to-be ex-husband. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. "That sounds like a poverty mindset, Marcus," I said, throwing Caleb's racist, arrogant insult right back into his face. "I suggest you pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Or better yet, go ask Chloe if she has room on her couch. Though I imagine she is currently looking for a shelter herself." As I watched them process their total inescapable ruin, a profound sense of closure washed over me. I had not just defeated them. I had completely erased their capacity to ever harm me or anyone else again. I turned my back on the wreckage. I did not wait for their protests. I did not wait for the inevitable wailing or the pathetic attempts at negotiation. There is no negotiating with a wrecking ball. I walked toward the massive front doors. The few catering staff members who had remained behind quickly stepped aside, clearing a path for me with wide, respectful eyes. They had spent the entire evening being treated like invisible servants by Vivian and Jasmine. Now they were watching the supposed royalty of Atlanta get tossed into the street by the very woman they had mocked. I stepped out into the humid Georgia night. The valet had already brought my car around, leaving the engine running. He handed me the keys without a word, his expression a mix of awe and sheer terror. I tipped him with a crisp $100 bill, slid into the driver's seat of my car, and closed the door, sealing away the screams and the chaos of the Thomas family forever. The leather of the steering wheel felt cool and grounding beneath my hands. I shifted the car into drive and let the engine purr to life, a low, steady growl that easily drowned out the muffled panic still radiating from the mansion behind me. I glided down the long, sweeping driveway, the manicured hedges, and aggressive landscape lighting, passing by like the background of a movie I was finally turning off. When I reached the heavy wrought iron gates, they opened smoothly, granting me access to the quiet, humid Atlanta night. I merged onto the main road and took one final look in the rearview mirror. The estate sat on the hill, still glowing with artificial light, but I knew the darkness inside was already consuming them. It was a tomb of their own making. The silence inside my car was absolute, and for the first time in 7 years, it was not a tense, waiting silence. It was the silence of total liberation. I drove through the winding streets of Buckhead, watching the city skyline reveal itself between the trees, and I felt a profound, unprecedented lightness in my chest. For 7 years, I had allowed myself to be cast as a supporting character in a fraudulent gospel. I had let a family of parasites convince me that my grit, my intellect, and my undeniable success were character flaws. They had weaponized my working-class background, trying to make me feel inadequate because I had built my wealth with my own 2 hands, instead of inheriting it from a hollow lineage. They expected me to shrink. Society expects women, especially highly successful Black women, to diminish their light, so the men around them do not feel blinded by their own mediocrity. We are told to carry the financial burdens, swallow the microaggressions, and maintain the illusion of a happy home at the absolute expense of our own sanity. Vivienne and Thomas sold that toxic theology from their pulpit every Sunday, training an entire congregation to value submission over self-respect. Jasmine and Marcus consumed that poison and regurgitated it, believing that proximity to Caleb's white privilege somehow elevated them above their own people. They hated me because I refused to play by those pathetic broken rules. I was the mirror reflecting their deep, unyielding insecurities. Every time I closed a multi-million-dollar acquisition, every time I refused to be intimidated by Caleb's counterfeit arrogance, I reminded them that their entire world was a carefully constructed lie. They tried to break me because they were already broken. But I refused to be their victim. I refused to let my hard-earned legacy be hijacked to fund the dirty secrets of a spineless man. There is a deeply ingrained narrative that tells us to simply walk away from toxic situations, to take the high road, to leave things in the hands of fate or karma. But on Wall Street, you learn very quickly that karma is not a reliable investment strategy. Sometimes taking the high road means you just get run over by a different bus. If you want true freedom, you do not just walk away from the table. You flip the table over, secure the assets, and make absolutely certain that the people who tried to destroy you lose their ability to ever sit at a table again. I did not just survive the Thomas family. I performed a hostile takeover of my own life. I audited my reality, identified the toxic liabilities, and liquidated them with extreme prejudice. I reclaimed my peace of mind with the exact same ruthless precision I used to dominate corporate boardrooms. The collateral damage they suffered was entirely self-inflicted. I simply provided the documentation and let the federal government do the rest. By Monday morning, Vanguard Capital would officially own Meridian Wealth Management. Marcus and Caleb would be staring at the inside of an interrogation room. Vivienne and Thomas would be handing their keys over to my foreclosure agents. And I would be sitting at the head of the most powerful executive table in the city, completely unbothered, commanding a 9-figure portfolio with absolutely no dead weight holding me down. True power is not about the money you accumulate or the titles you hold. True power is the absolute unwavering conviction in your own worth. It is the refusal to apologize for your brilliance. It is the courage to look at the people who demand your submission and tell them exactly what the price of your peace is going to cost them. I paid my dues, I secured my assets, and I walked out of that mansion a completely free woman. If you are watching this right now, I want you to take a very close look at your own life. Are you shrinking yourself to fit into a room that is too small for your ambition? Are you carrying the financial or emotional burdens of people who secretly resent your success? Are you letting toxic family members, manipulative in-laws, or a cowardly partner dictate your worth? Do not wait for them to change. Do not wait for an apology that is never going to come. Audit your life. Identify the people who are draining your energy, your finances, and your joy. Stop asking for a seat at their miserable table and start building your own empire. You have the power to rewrite your narrative, but you have to be willing to strike the match and burn the illusions to the ground. I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to ruthlessly cut off toxic family members to protect your peace? Have you ever watched the people who tried to break you face the ultimate consequences of their own actions? Drop your story in the comments below. Let this community know how you took your power back. Share this video with anyone who needs the courage to finally stand up, draw a hard line, and refuse to be a victim. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story of absolute unapologetic victory. Because surviving is fine, but dominating your own life is so much better. Keep your standards high, keep your boundaries impenetrable, and never ever apologize for winning.